It was a chilly November evening when Jason Hartley, a successful millionaire businessman, stood in front of his sprawling mansion, watching the sunset over the horizon. Everything in his life seemed perfect: his luxurious home, expensive cars, and the freedom that came with wealth. But there was one thing he had never expected to change his life in the most unimaginable way. 13 years ago, it all started with a decision that seemed small at the time, but would go on to haunt him forever. Jason had hired a woman named Clara, a young, ambitious woman from a humble background, to work as a maid in his home. She was hardworking, polite, and did everything with a smile. Her presence in his household was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, something that would simply make his life easier. What he never anticipated was that the connection between them would spark a series of events that would shake his world to its core. Clara wasn't just another maid. She was someone with her own dreams, her own desires, and a past that she had worked hard to bury. Jason, on the other hand, was used to getting whatever he wanted. But that power, in this case, would lead him to make a decision that would change everything. What started as a brief affair between the two of them would soon lead to consequences neither of them could have imagined. Clara found herself pregnant, carrying Jason's child, and that's when things took a sharp turn. Jason, in his panic, pushed Clara out of his life with the coldest of decisions. He offered no support, no real apology, and essentially kicked her to the curb. To him, it was just another mistake to erase, another chapter to close. He couldn't afford the scandal. He couldn't let anyone know. And so, Clara disappeared from his life, taking with her a secret that no one could know about, especially Jason. Years passed. Jason continued to live his life as though nothing had ever happened, achieving even greater heights of success. But as life often does, it had a way of reminding him of the things he'd tried so hard to forget. Fast forward to the present day. Jason is now a man in his late 40s, living with the weight of the years of decisions that have shaped his life. But little does he know that the past is about to come knocking on his door in the most unexpected way. Clara, now a woman who has rebuilt her life, returns after all these years, and this time she isn't alone. She walks into Jason's life with a confidence that shakes him to his core. But what is it that she's come back for? And more importantly, what does she have that will change everything for Jason? As Jason stands at the threshold of his door, staring at the woman who once was part of his world, he is filled with a sense of dread. The quiet life he thought he had built is about to crumble. What does Clara want after all these years of silence? And what will be the consequences of the choices he made so long ago? In the next part of this story, you'll find out the shocking truth that Clara has been hiding. It's something that could ruin everything Jason has worked for. And the twist? It might just be the beginning of a whole new chapter for both of them. Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Jason stood frozen, his hand hovering above the doorbell, his heart pounding in his chest. He had barely processed the sight of Clara standing before him. How much she had changed in the years since they last crossed paths. Gone was the young, timid woman who had once quietly cleaned his mansion. In her place stood a woman full of poise and quiet strength. But it wasn't just her appearance that unsettled him. It was the look in her eyes, the look of someone who had seen and experienced far more than Jason had ever imagined. The years between them felt like a blur, but the truth of what happened still lingered in Jason's mind. He had convinced himself that kicking Clara out of his life had been the only choice. After all, his reputation, his wealth, his entire future were at risk. No one could know about the affair, no one could know about the child. To him, it was a mistake that had to be erased. But he had never stopped to consider the consequences of his actions on Clara or the child she carried. He had never thought about the woman's pain, the struggles she faced after he'd thrown her out with nothing but a few dollars in her pocket. Jason finally dropped his hand and opened the door, his voice shaking slightly. "Clara, what are you doing here?" She didn't speak right away. Instead, she stepped forward, her presence commanding the room. Jason noticed the way she held herself, as if she had carried burdens he couldn't fathom. She wasn't the same woman who had worked for him all those years ago. This Clara seemed more assured of herself, as though the hardship she'd endured had made her stronger, more unshakable. For a moment, there was a silence between them, one that felt thick with unspoken words, things that neither of them had said to one another in over a decade. Jason tried to search her face for any hint of anger or resentment, but her expression was unreadable. "Clara," he repeated, his voice softer this time, "what do you want?" She met his gaze, and for a moment, Jason thought he saw a flicker of something, a flicker of the girl he once knew. But then it was gone. "I think it's time we had a conversation," Clara said, her voice calm, but firm. Jason swallowed, not sure what to expect, but fearing the worst. About what? Clara took a deep breath, glancing over her shoulder as though to make sure no one was watching. It was a small gesture, but it felt important, like she was bracing herself for something. Finally, she stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Jason hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to handle the situation, but then followed her into the house. They stood in the foyer of his mansion, a place Jason had spent countless hours in over the years. But tonight, it felt different. The house, which once symbolized success and power, now seemed cold and impersonal, almost alien. Clara had been here before, of course, but back then, she was just another part of the house, someone who had no real place in his world. Now, everything had changed. Clara didn't waste any time. "You don't recognize me anymore, do you?" Jason blinked, taken aback by the question. "Of course I do." She nodded, almost as if she were expecting that answer. "I wasn't just your maid, Jason. I was a person. I had a life, dreams, and when you made the choice you did, you changed everything for me. But you weren't the only one who had to live with the consequences. So did I." Jason felt a wave of guilt wash over him, but he quickly pushed it aside. It had been years. He had moved on. He had rebuilt his life, his fortune. What good would guilt do him now? "I never wanted things to go the way they did," Jason said, his voice strained. "I never meant to hurt you, but the situation was complicated." Clara finished for him, her tone sharp. "Yeah, I remember how complicated it was. But do you know what? I never asked for any of it. I didn't ask to be dragged into your mess." Jason opened his mouth, but Clara raised her hand to silence him. She wasn't done. "You kicked me out with nothing. No money, no support. Just a cold, empty offer to make everything go away. But you couldn't erase what happened, could you?" The words stung, and Jason's mind scrambled for a response. He hadn't expected her to come back with this kind of fire. He had expected, well, he didn't know what he had expected. Apologies, a plea for help, something that would make him feel justified in the way he'd acted. But instead, he was faced with a woman who had clearly survived, someone who had turned the very circumstances he had tried to bury into a source of strength. "I never wanted to hurt you," Jason repeated, the words now feeling hollow, as though they held no weight anymore. "But it was just a mistake. And I don't know what you expect from me now, Clara." Clara took a step closer, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I expect you to face the truth. I expect you to understand that the choices you made back then affected more than just you." Jason's heart raced. There was something in her words, something unspoken that made him uneasy. "What do you mean?" Clara paused, her gaze shifting as though she were weighing how much to reveal. She was playing a dangerous game, and Jason could tell she wasn't going to show her cards all at once. But when she spoke again, her voice was steady, almost calculated. "I didn't come here to make you feel guilty, Jason," she said, each word measured. "I came here because there's something you need to know, something you don't know, and it's time you did." Jason's breath caught in his throat. There was a weight in her words, a promise of something bigger, something that would change everything. He took a step forward, his pulse quickening. "What is it? What are you talking about?" Clara looked at him, a brief flicker of emotion crossing her face before she masked it again. "You have a son, Jason, a son who's been living without his father for all these years." Jason's world seemed to stop in that moment. His heart seemed to skip a beat, his mind reeling. A son. How could that be possible? He felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. His hands suddenly felt clammy. This wasn't possible, was it? 13 years had passed. 13 years of living in ignorance, pretending a mistake was just that, a mistake. But Clara's expression never wavered. You didn't just get rid of me, Jason. You abandoned your child. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, suffocating him. He could barely breathe, could barely process what she had just said. A son, his son. Jason's mind spun as the reality of her words began to sink in. Clara was watching him closely, waiting for some kind of reaction, but all Jason could do was stand there, frozen, his mind racing with a million questions. What was he supposed to say? What could he say? But as the silence stretched on, one thing was certain: his life, the perfect life he had so carefully built, was about to unravel. And the truth, the long-buried secret, was no longer something he could ignore. The story was far from over, and now Jason had no choice but to face the consequences of the past. But what would happen next? Only time would tell. Jason's mind was spinning, his thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief. A son. It felt impossible, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. His legs grew weak, and he had to steady himself against the doorframe, trying to comprehend what Clara had just told him. A child, his child. How could he not know? How could he have lived all these years without knowing he had a son somewhere out there in the world? Clara stood in front of him, calm and composed, as if delivering a simple message. But Jason could see the tightness in her jaw, the way her eyes flickered with something more, something deeper than just anger or hurt. There was a determination in her now, one that made Jason uneasy. This wasn't just about revenge or bitterness. There was something else at play, something Jason was still too afraid to fully grasp. "Why are you telling me this now?" Jason's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "After all this time, why come back now?" Clara's gaze never wavered. She folded her arms, almost as though she were protecting herself from the storm of emotions Jason was struggling to contain. "Because it's time for you to face the truth. Your son deserves to know who you are. He deserves to have a father who isn't just some stranger in his past." Jason felt his chest tighten at the mention of his son. It wasn't just guilt that flooded through him, it was fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of the responsibility he had so easily avoided all those years ago. He had thought he could bury it all, pretend it never happened. But now the past was standing in front of him, refusing to be ignored any longer. "You're not making sense," Jason stammered, his words coming out too quickly. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you give me a chance to?" "To what?" Clara interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp, her calm demeanor slipping for a moment. "To fix it. To pretend like nothing happened. Do you think I wanted to drag you back into my life? Do you think it was easy for me, Jason? To raise your child alone, without any help, while you went on with your perfect life?" Jason flinched at the bitterness in her voice. He had never truly understood the weight of her sacrifice. He had never seen her struggle, never seen the life she had to build without him. He had been too focused on his own ambitions, on his own success, to realize that the consequences of his actions were far-reaching. Clara wasn't just a maid he discarded. She was a woman who had fought for everything she had, and now she was standing here, forcing him to confront the truth. "I had to make choices," Jason said quietly, though his words felt hollow. "I did what I thought was best for everyone." Clara shook her head slowly, as if she had heard this excuse too many times. "You didn't make the right choices, Jason, and now your son has grown up without you. Without any of the things a father should give his child, and you think you can just step in now, like it's all going to be okay." Jason's heart sank. He had never imagined it would be easy, but the weight of Clara's words was suffocating. How could he fix something that had been broken for so long? How could he be a father when he had been absent for 13 years? He tried to speak, but no words came out. The silence between them felt like a heavy blanket, stifling everything he wanted to say. The years had stretched so far apart, and now that they were face to face again, everything felt too distant to bridge. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Jason, Clara continued, her voice steady once more. But your son deserves a chance. A chance to know who you are, what you did, and why you were never there for him. He deserves more than you gave me. Jason looked at Clara, his mind racing. He wanted to argue, to explain, but he couldn't. There was no excuse for what he had done, no justification that would make it right. And yet, a part of him, an unfamiliar, quiet part of him, felt an undeniable pull to understand this boy, this son he never knew existed. But just as quickly as that thought appeared, doubt crept in. What if he wasn't ready for this? What if the boy didn't want him? What if he had built a life without needing his father, and Jason was just a shadow in his past? The fear of rejection was overwhelming. The thought that he might never be able to make up for lost years haunted him. Clara watched him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. She wasn't looking for an apology, not in the way Jason expected. She was asking for something much harder, for him to face the consequences of his actions, to acknowledge the pain he had caused, and to step into a role he had avoided for so long. Jason took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. What do you want me to do? Clara hesitated, her gaze softening for just a moment. I want you to meet him. I want you to see the person you helped create. But it's up to you, Jason. I can't force you to do anything. But I'm not going to hide the truth from him any longer. Jason's chest tightened as the reality of her words settled in. She was asking him to face something he wasn't sure he was ready for. He had built an empire, surrounded himself with people who respected him, and yet none of that mattered now. It was just him, standing before the woman who had once been part of his life, and the weight of a son who had grown up without him. What if he doesn't want to know me? Jason asked, his voice barely a whisper. What if it's too late? Clara shook her head. You won't know unless you try. You can't undo the past, Jason, but you can start to make things right. Don't run from it. You owe him that much. Jason stood there, the words hanging in the air between them. He knew she was right, but the fear of facing a son who might never accept him was suffocating. What if the boy didn't want a father? What if he had already built a life of his own, a life that didn't need him? The thought gnawed at Jason, but Clara's presence, her quiet strength, seemed to give him a sense of urgency. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the child who had grown up without a father, who had carried a part of Jason's past with him all these years. I'll do it, Jason said finally, the words heavy on his tongue. I'll meet him. I'll do whatever it takes. Clara nodded slowly, her eyes still unreadable. Good. I'll take you to him. But remember, this is your chance. Don't waste it. As Clara turned and began to walk toward the door, Jason stood rooted to the spot, his mind reeling with the weight of the decision he had just made. The past was no longer something he could ignore. It was a part of him now, and facing it meant stepping into the unknown. But as he followed Clara out the door, the uncertainty of what awaited him loomed larger than ever. Would his son accept him? Would he be able to repair the years of damage he had done? Or would the distance between them be too great to overcome? The journey ahead was full of questions, and Jason knew he had no answers. Only time would tell. The drive to Clara's home felt like the longest journey of Jason's life. The streets blurred past in a haze, the steady hum of the car's engine doing little to settle the storm raging inside him. Every mile that brought him closer to his son was a mile that pulled him further from the life he'd built. His hands were clammy on the seat, his heart racing with each passing moment. He had spent so many years distancing himself from the past, pretending it didn't exist, but the reality of facing it now was almost too much to bear. Clara didn't speak much on the way. Her silence was thick, charged with an energy Jason couldn't quite read. She wasn't angry anymore, but there was something else in her eyes. A quiet determination that unsettled him. It was as if she already knew what was going to happen, and she was ready for it. He wasn't. Every time he thought he had his thoughts together, another wave of doubt would hit him. What would his son be like? Would he be angry? Would he hate him for abandoning him all these years? Clara's house wasn't much to look at. It was small, modest, a stark contrast to the wealth and opulence of Jason's mansion. The yard was neatly kept, but there were no flashy cars or oversized decorations. It felt like a place built on resilience, a place that had weathered storms. It made Jason feel small, and for the first time in a long time, vulnerable. She parked a car outside, and Jason didn't wait for her to open the door. He had to get out, had to steady his breath. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped out onto the grass, the chill of the evening air biting at his skin. His mind was racing again, but there was no turning back. Not now. He had come this far. Clara didn't say anything as she led him to the door. Jason's legs felt heavy, and with each step, the weight of what was about to happen pressed down on him. He had been prepared to face the consequences of his past, but now that he was on the brink of meeting his son, he wasn't so sure. The years had created an insurmountable distance. How could he just walk in and be a father? Was it even possible to repair something that had been broken for so long? Clara knocked on the door, her knuckles tapping lightly on the wood. Jason stood frozen, his eyes trained on the door, waiting for the inevitable. His breath was shallow, his mind blank. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure of anything. The door opened slowly, and Jason's stomach churned. A tall young man stood in the doorway, his features strikingly similar to Jason's. He was lean, with dark hair, and his eyes, a deep brown, shone with a quiet intensity. But it wasn't just the physical resemblance that stopped Jason in his tracks. It was the look in the boy's eyes. There was a guardedness there, a wariness that Jason couldn't shake. The moment he met his gaze, Jason felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted. "Mom." The boy's voice was low, but there was a subtle tremor in it. Clara stepped forward, her hand resting gently on the young man's shoulder. "This is Jason," she said, her voice steady but soft. "Your father." The word hung in the air like a weight, heavy and uncertain. Jason couldn't move, couldn't find his voice. The boy, his son, just stood there, looking at him with an expression Jason couldn't quite read. Was he angry, disappointed, or was it something else entirely? For a long moment, there was silence. Jason searched the boy's face, trying to find a trace of familiarity, something that would connect them. But all he saw was a stranger who had lived his life without him. A stranger who had every right to hate him for what he had done. I didn't know," Jason finally said, the words awkward and clumsy. "I didn't know about you. I didn't know you existed." The boy didn't respond right away. Instead, he stepped back from the door, glancing briefly at Clara before looking back at Jason. There was something in his eyes that Jason couldn't place, a flicker of something deeper, something painful. "Why didn't you come for me?" the boy asked, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of hurt. Jason's throat tightened, the weight of the question almost too much to bear. He had no answer, no good answer. He had spent so many years justifying his actions to himself, but standing here, facing the son he never knew, he realized that none of those justifications mattered anymore. All the money, the success, the empire he had built, none of it had prepared him for this. I don't have an excuse," Jason stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong. I should have been there. I should have tried. But I didn't know. I didn't know how to fix it." The boy didn't seem to be moved by his words. He just stood there, studying Jason, as if trying to make sense of this moment. The silence between them stretched out, heavy and thick, and Jason couldn't tell if he was being judged or if the boy was simply processing the reality of the situation. Finally, the boy spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You're not what I thought you'd be." Jason's heart skipped a beat. "What did you think I'd be?" The boy hesitated, looking down for a moment, then back up at Jason. "I don't know. Someone different, I guess. Someone who would have wanted to be here. But you're just here. Now." Jason swallowed hard, the sting of those words cutting deeper than he expected. There was no anger, no hatred, just indifference, like Jason was a ghost that had appeared out of nowhere. The realization hit him with a gut punch. The boy didn't need him. He didn't even want him. Clara stepped forward then, placing a hand on her son's shoulder. This is hard for both of you, but it's important. I've kept this from you for a long time, but it's time for you to know the truth. The boy, still silent, turned his eyes toward Clara, his expression unreadable. There was something in his face, something that reminded Jason of himself when he was young. A hardness, a guardedness that came from surviving in a world that hadn't always been kind. Jason's mind raced, but no matter how many times he tried to think of something to say, the words wouldn't come. The tension in the room was unbearable, and he could feel the boy's eyes on him, waiting for some kind of answer that Jason didn't have. And then, as if sensing that the moment was slipping away, Clara spoke again. You can't change the past, Jason, but you have a chance now to do something. You don't get a second chance at this. Jason felt his chest tighten as the weight of her words settled in. There was no running from this, no pretending it didn't matter. This was his son, standing in front of him. And no matter how hard Jason tried to justify his choices, none of it would erase the years that had been lost. The air in the room was thick with anticipation, and Jason knew that this was the moment that would define everything. But what would happen next? Would he be able to earn his son's trust? Or had the distance between them already grown too wide to bridge? With a heavy heart, Jason took a step forward, not knowing if he was walking toward redemption or a final, painful rejection. Just as Jason took a hesitant step forward, the air around him seemed to shift. The boy's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something new crossing his face, something Jason couldn't quite place. It was subtle, but it was enough to make him pause in his tracks. The tension in the room thickened, almost suffocating, as if the moment were teetering on the edge of something Jason wasn't prepared for. I didn't just come here for you, Jason, the boy said suddenly, his voice colder now. Jason felt a chill run through him. It wasn't anger he heard in his son's voice. It was something far more unsettling. I came here because of him. The words hit Jason like a punch to the gut. He blinked, his mind scrambling to catch up. What do you mean? His voice cracked slightly, the question sounding feeble even to his own ears. The boy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped back, his posture stiff, almost defensive. Clara's eyes darted between them, and Jason could see the flicker of something, regret maybe, or fear, cross her face. Who? Jason repeated, his mind racing. Who are you talking about? The boy's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, Jason thought he wasn't going to answer. But then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned to the side, glancing toward the hallway behind him. Jason's heart skipped a beat as another figure emerged from the shadows. The figure was tall, dressed in a dark suit that looked too expensive for this small home. His face was hard, emotionless, his expression cold as he stepped into the room, his presence seemingly filling every corner. Jason's stomach dropped. He knew who this was. Or at least he thought he did. Dad, the boy said, his voice now edged with something darker, more calculated. This is Robert. Jason's mind reeled, trying to make sense of the situation. Robert. The name didn't register at first, but then it hit him like a lightning bolt. Robert was one of Jason's oldest business rivals, a man he had done everything in his power to outpace and outsmart. A man who had always been just a few steps ahead, no matter how hard Jason tried to keep up. And now here he was, standing in front of him, looking at him with a quiet but dangerous intensity. Jason's mouth went dry. His heart raced. The last thing he had expected was to see someone like Robert, someone from his world, tied to this mess in any way. But the connection was undeniable. Robert's eyes locked onto Jason's with an almost predatory gaze, as if he was sizing him up, waiting for the right moment to strike. This is the man you're running from, isn't it? Robert's voice was low, almost mocking. The man who abandoned you. The man who never once cared to look back. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The realization hit him with crushing force. This wasn't just about a son he had never known. This wasn't just a matter of a past mistake. There was something far deeper at play. Jason's empire, his carefully crafted life, was suddenly at risk in a way he couldn't have foreseen. Robert wasn't just an outsider. He was someone who had been watching, waiting, biding his time. And now it seemed he had orchestrated a much darker plan. Clara stepped forward, her eyes flickering with something Jason couldn't interpret. "I didn't tell you everything, Jason," she said quietly, her voice filled with something akin to regret. "There are things you don't know, things you never understood." Jason's mind raced. What was she saying? What did he not know? "I told you your son deserved to know the truth," Clara continued, her eyes not meeting his. "But I didn't tell you that Robert is the one who has been raising him. He's the one who's been there, not you." Jason's blood ran cold. "What?" he gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's not my son's father." Clara shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. "No, but he's the one who stepped in when you didn't. He's the one who cared enough to be there. The one who taught him how to survive, how to fight, how to be strong." Jason stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling as though the floor had been pulled out from under him. This wasn't just about a child who had grown up without him. This was about betrayal, manipulation, and a power struggle that had been playing out right under his nose. Robert had been playing the long game, and Jason hadn't even realized it. The boy, who Jason had assumed was just angry, stepped forward, his gaze locking with Jason's. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice colder now, sharper. "You think you can just walk back into our lives, make everything better. But you're wrong. It's too late for that." Jason opened his mouth, but no words came out. He couldn't speak, couldn't form a coherent thought. Everything he had believed, everything he had worked for, was crumbling before him. Robert hadn't just been a rival in business. He had been an invisible force in Jason's life, playing a far more dangerous game than Jason could have ever anticipated. Clara finally met Jason's eyes, her face filled with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "You weren't the one who mattered. You were never the one who mattered to him." Jason's world spun as the weight of her words settled into his bones. All these years, he had thought his success had meant something. He had believed that his wealth, his power, would give him control over his past. But in one moment, it became clear that all of it had been meaningless. Robert had always been the one with the influence, the one who had shaped the life of his son, and Jason had been nothing but a bystander in his own story. The boy, his son, stepped back, a bitter smile creeping onto his lips. "You were never meant to be his father. You were just a distraction, a tool in a much bigger game." Jason felt his legs go weak. He had always been so sure of himself, so certain that his decisions would lead him to victory. But now, as Robert's presence loomed larger and larger in the room, Jason realized the truth. He had been played by the very people he thought he had outsmarted. Clara's eyes lingered on him one last time, filled with a sadness that pierced through him like a knife. "It's over, Jason," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. "You lost." Jason felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. The walls of his carefully constructed life had crumbled, and all that was left was the cold, harsh reality of his mistakes. What had he really been fighting for? What had all his ambition amounted to if he couldn't even hold on to the people who mattered most? The finality of the moment hung in the air like a suffocating fog, and Jason knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But even as the weight of his failure pressed down on him, one question lingered in his mind. What would Robert do next? The storm was far from over, and Jason was standing at the eye of it, with no idea how much worse it would get. Jason stood there, frozen, the weight of Clara's words sinking in. He had thought everything was falling apart, but his years of success and the empire he had built had been nothing compared to the man standing before him, holding the power that Jason had longed for. But there was still something gnawing at him, something that didn't sit right in his gut. Robert stepped forward, his eyes colder than ever. "You think you can walk in and fix everything, but you've already lost, Jason," he said, his voice filled with a mix of triumph and disdain. "This has been my world for a long time. Your world It's irrelevant now. The boy, his son, didn't speak. He just stared at Jason with that same unreadable expression. There was no anger in his eyes, no hate, just emptiness, like he had already made peace with the idea that Jason was never going to be the father he needed. Jason's chest tightened, but he didn't give in. "You're right," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I've lost. But that doesn't mean I'm going to let you control everything. Not this. Not anymore." For a split second, Robert looked surprised. Then he smirked, as if Jason's defiance was nothing more than a fleeting moment of foolishness. But Jason wasn't finished. His mind was racing now, trying to piece everything together, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. And then, in that moment of clarity, it all clicked. "I didn't come here for your forgiveness," Jason said, locking eyes with the boy. "I didn't come here to fix everything in a single conversation. I came here because you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to know my side of this story." Clara's face faltered for a moment. She opened her mouth to speak, but Jason held up his hand, silencing her. He wasn't done. He had spent years running from his past, hiding behind his success, thinking that it would all go away if he could just push hard enough. But now, staring at the boy he never knew he had, he realized that facing his mistakes was the only way forward. "I wasn't just some absent father. I wasn't just some mistake that never tried," Jason said, his voice rising with emotion. "I didn't know about you. I didn't know she was pregnant. But when I found out, it was too late. By then, my life was already spiraling. I didn't have the courage to face you or her, or my own demons. And that's on me." There was a heavy silence as the words hung in the air. The boy's face remained unreadable, but Jason saw something flicker in his eyes, something small, almost imperceptible. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but it was the first sign of something more: curiosity, doubt. Jason took a step closer, heart pounding. "But I'm here now. I can't undo the past, but I can be a part of your future. I'm not going to run anymore. I'm not going to make the same mistake twice." Robert's cold laugh cut through the tension. "And what makes you think he needs you now? After all these years?" Jason turned to Robert, eyes blazing. "Because unlike you, I care about him. And I'll do whatever it takes to make up for the time I lost. You can't buy that, Robert. You can't manipulate it. It's something you'll never understand." The boy, his son, finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "You don't know what it's like to grow up without a father, to always wonder if you were good enough for him to care, if you were good enough to be worth his time." Jason's heart shattered at the pain in his son's voice. "I failed you," he whispered, his eyes filled with regret. "But I'm here now, and I swear to you I won't leave again." For a long moment, the boy didn't respond. His gaze flicked between Jason and Robert, as if weighing his options. The room felt charged with electricity, every second stretched painfully thin, until at last he spoke. "I don't know if I can believe you," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know if I can trust anything you say. You're just like him." He nodded toward Robert. "You both think you can just come into my life, make a big show, and expect me to just forgive everything." Jason's heart clenched as the boy's words hit home. He couldn't expect forgiveness. He couldn't expect things to be okay just because he showed up. But there was one thing he could give, one thing that Robert would never be able to. Jason dropped his gaze to the floor for a moment, collecting his thoughts. Then, looking directly into his son's eyes, he said softly, "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, but I'm asking for a chance. A chance to prove that I can be the father you never had, that I can be the man you deserve, and that I'll fight for you. For us, no more games, no more lies." The boy stared at him, his eyes narrowing as if searching for the truth in Jason's words. And then slowly he nodded, not out of forgiveness, but out of something else, something like cautious hope. "I'll think about it," the boy said, his voice still cold, but not as distant as before. "But this isn't over. Don't think that just because you said the right words means I'm going to forget everything that's happened." Jason nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. I wouldn't expect you to. But just as he thought he might have broken through, just as he felt the tiny glimmer of hope spark between them, Robert stepped forward, his expression darkening. You really think you've won? He sneered. You think you can just waltz in here, say a few words, and fix everything? Jason looked at Robert, feeling the old familiar resentment bubble up inside him. This isn't about winning, Robert. This is about doing what's right. And you? You've been playing a game this whole time, but it's over now. Robert's lips curled into a sinister grin. You're naive, Jason. You still don't understand, do you? I didn't come here to win. He stepped closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. I came here to make sure you lost. Jason's eyes widened in realization, his mind racing. Before he could process it, Robert pulled out a folder from his jacket pocket and slapped it down on the table. The weight of the paper was like a final nail in the coffin. It was a legal document. You think you've got time to make up for your mistakes? Robert's smile widened, as if savoring the moment. Think again. I've got control of everything now. Your business, your assets, your reputation. It's all mine. Jason's blood ran cold as the document in front of him sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't just a business contract. It was a claim to everything Jason had worked for. And with it, Robert now held the power to destroy everything. But Jason wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not after everything he'd fought for. His son's future. His own redemption. He wasn't going to lose. Not like this. And as the room stood still, the stakes higher than ever, Jason knew one thing for sure. The battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Jason stood there, staring at the legal documents in front of him, his heart pounding in his chest. Robert's smug grin only deepened as he saw the shock on Jason's face. Every instinct told him to react, to lash out. But this time, Jason held his ground. He could feel his son's eyes on him, waiting to see what he would do next. He couldn't let this be the end of the story. Not like this. You're right about one thing, Robert, Jason said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. I don't understand your game, but I don't need to. What I do know is that I'm not going to let you take everything I've worked for. Robert's smile faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing. Oh, and how do you plan on stopping me, Jason? You've already lost. Jason looked down at the folder, his fingers running over the edges. He had no idea what kind of leverage Robert thought he had, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this man ruin everything. Not his business. Not his relationship with his son. He had already lost too much. I've learned a lot over the years, Jason said, looking Robert square in the eyes. But one thing I didn't learn until recently was how to fight for what matters. And right now, that's my family. That's my son. There was a long silence as Robert processed Jason's words. The boy remained still, his expression unreadable, but Jason could see a flicker of something in his eyes, something that gave him hope. Maybe it was the truth that Jason had finally spoken. Maybe it was the understanding that, despite everything, Jason was still trying. But Robert wasn't backing down. You think you've got what it takes to stand against me? I've built everything you see here. I've been in control long before you even knew this kid existed. Jason took a deep breath. I might not have had control before, but I do now. You've underestimated me. And that's a mistake you won't make again. Jason didn't wait for Robert to respond. He picked up the folder, holding it firmly in his hands, and then dropped it onto the floor. The sound of the paper hitting the ground felt almost final, like an official end to the manipulations that Robert had orchestrated. For a moment, it felt like everything was frozen in time. Then, with a sudden movement, Jason reached into his pocket and pulled out a second set of documents. Robert's eyes widened as he recognized them, contracts for a partnership that Jason had been working on quietly for months. A deal that would give him a stronger position in the company, enough to counteract Robert's influence. You see, Robert, Jason continued, I didn't come here unprepared. I've been working on this in the background, gathering the right people. You've been playing your game, but I've been building mine. And now I've got the leverage I need to take back control. Robert's smug expression faltered. You think you can just undo everything I've done? Jason didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned toward his son. For the first time since he had walked into this room, he saw something different in his eyes. Not anger, not hate, but something that resembled the first stirrings of trust. A hesitant hope that Jason might be telling the truth. That maybe, just maybe, he wasn't too late. I've been a fool, Jason said softly, his voice filled with regret. I can't change the past, but I want to build something real with you. Not for me, but for you. For both of us. The boy didn't speak right away, but Jason saw the conflict in his eyes. This was it, the turning point. Jason had no idea how this would all play out, but he knew that he had to make the effort. He had to show his son that he was more than just words, that he was willing to fight for him, no matter the cost. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the boy nodded. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Jason felt a weight lift from his chest. The battle was far from over, but this was a victory. A small but significant step forward. Robert stood there for a moment, looking between Jason and the boy, his expression one of disbelief. You think I'll just walk away? He spat. This isn't over, Jason. Not by a long shot. Jason didn't flinch. I'm not walking away anymore, Robert, and you don't get to decide how this ends. With that, Robert turned on his heel, storming out of the room. Jason didn't watch him leave. Instead, he focused on his son, who was still standing there, unsure of what came next. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Jason said gently, but I need you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. The boy looked up at him, his face softening just slightly. I don't know if I can trust you yet, he said, his voice quiet, but I think I might be willing to try. Jason smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and hope. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in years, Jason felt like he had something to fight for that was truly worth it. As the boy stepped closer, Jason reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. It wasn't an offer of forgiveness or a promise of an easy road. It was a simple gesture, an acknowledgement of the road ahead. And as they stood there together, Jason knew that the real work was just beginning. He wasn't sure how long it would take to rebuild everything, his business, his relationships, his own sense of self, but he was ready to face it, ready to prove that no matter the mistakes of the past, he could still build something worth fighting for. The boy's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, then he nodded again, a small but meaningful gesture. All right, he said softly. Let's see where this goes. As Jason watched him walk away, he knew that this was just the first step. But it was the right step, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The story wasn't over, but now at least it was on the right track, and whatever the future held, Jason was ready to face it, with his son by his side.